Hey, this is Bobby Hunt 3, and today I have Dr. William Grant. Is a researcher. He's an expert, one of the world's foremost experts on vitamin D. He also deals with chronic infections and disease, and he's really been into researching the effects of vitamin D on COVID-19 lately. I think you've written over 300 peer-reviewed research papers on vitamin D and related to vitamin D and sunlight, as well as written probably what I would say is one of the top 3 best books on light and health out there. If you don't have this book, it's called Embrace the Sun. You've got to go get it on Amazon today or on Dr. Grant's website. Dr. Grant's website is sunarc.org, sunarc.org, and you can follow him at Twitter at WBGrant2. So hi, Dr. Grant. How are you?
Hi, thanks for the introduction.
Thank you very much for coming on. This is awesome. So to start off here, I want to talk about some topics in your book, Embrace the Sun. And the first one is sunlight and melanoma. So my dermatologist scares the hell out of me when it comes to sunshine, getting sunshine, and the topic she brings up most is melanoma. You don't want to catch melanoma from the sun. You want to cover up, wear sunscreen, stay out of the sun from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. every single day of your life. What do you have to say about this? Does sun cause melanoma?
That's bad advice. Actually, the sun is sort of a double-edged sword when it comes to melanoma. It does contribute to the risk of melanoma, but also protects against melanoma. The observational evidence includes such things as in the Navy, Cedric Garland and colleagues years ago looked at 2 groups of people. They looked at the submariners and the deckhands and asked, well, which group had the largest risk of rate of melanoma? It turns out it was the submariners, not the deckhands. And that was probably because the deckhands, by being up on top of the ship, they were tanning themselves, creating more melanin to block the UV from getting down to the lower layer of the skin. But they were also producing vitamin D. And melanoma is like many other cancers. Vitamin D reduces the risk, the progression, and metastasis. Now, it turns out that the more important wavelength for melanoma is the long-wave UVA. So UVA is from maybe 315, 320 nanometers to 400 nanometers, whereas UVB is from, solar UVB is from 290 to 315 nanometers. So UVA can penetrate deeper, and it does more. It's much more abundant than UVB.
So would you say part of the reason for maybe a melanoma sun issue would be that people who were wearing sunscreens that really blocked out, at least initially, the majority of sunscreens, I want to say, blocked out all the UVB and let just the UVA come in.
Right. And Cedric Garland and colleagues have shown that as sunscreens became more widely used and more effective and all that, melanoma rates went up in Connecticut. Now in Europe, I think they were blocking more of the UVA, but our Food and Drug Administration didn't want to approve the UVA blocking compounds, saying that they might have toxic compounds that get into the skin. And so the United States sunscreens are not as broad spectrum as the European ones.
So what we've also seen is that melanoma rates supposedly are going up. Now, I know there's a caveat to that. Your dermatologist would like you to think that they're going up, a lot. But there is some evidence out there showing that it might be going up dramatically due to misdiagnosis or benign lesions.
Right. There's a lot of melanoma in situ that never goes anywhere, or whatever it's called. It's just sort of a superficial type.
A pre-melanoma, could you call it? That they say, and they take that off, but really that's kind of some more money to their bottom line every time they cut off a mole.
Right.
I know
Let me show you a map here of melanoma rates in the United States. What you can see is that melanoma rates are higher in the southern part of the country for males. But if you look at the rate, it's around 2 or 3 cases per 100,000 per year. You look at all the other cancers, you've got maybe 1,000 or so cases per 100,000 per year.
Wow.
So it's like the tail wagging the dog.
Right.
And the dermatologists make money by promoting melanoma as a risk factor. You get people coming in for diagnosis. They also help sell sunscreen. And so your sunscreen manufacturers are some of the biggest proponents of the concern about melanoma.
So as the sun exposure with the melanoma rates, and there's 3, what did you say, 3 out of 100,000?
100,000 per year. Mm-hmm.
Whereas some other cancers, it's 1,000.
Very high. Let's see if I have that here. All cancers, okay, it's 209 cases per 100,000 per year total. So 1.5% of all cancer is melanoma death rates.
And there's a lot of evidence showing that sunlight exposure for those other cancers, breast, colon, everything like that, reduces your risk of getting breast cancer, of getting those big cancers. Right.
Right. And what's happened is, the map I showed you was from 1970 to 1950, 1969. What's happened after about 1990 is that these great geographical variations in cancer rates have almost disappeared because people are wearing sunscreen, avoiding the sun, people are more obese now, which reduces vitamin D concentrations, and also there's better treatment for cancer. So it's more difficult to show that sun is reducing the risk of cancer.
So with the basically increased sunscreen use, people are going outside right now, but they're wearing clothes, they're wearing hats, they're wearing sunglasses, and most people work indoors all day long.
Right.
With all of that, that's changed over the last, 100 years or so.
75, 50, 75. When I grew up in Sacramento, I got sunburned every summer as a kid. I have no melanoma, no cancer.
No melanoma and cancer. So what would you, so if it's not the sun specifically that's causing melanoma, do you think it's the decrease in sun exposure, which leads to a decrease in the amount of vitamin D you make that protects you from cancers and melanoma? As well as maybe the extra exposure to fake light indoors all day long, or UVA just coming through your glass and windows blocking UVB?
That could play a role. Also, like you said, the dermatologists have the shadow rule. Stay out of the sun when your shadow is shorter than you are. The vitamin D experts have the inverse shadow rule. Go out in the sun when your shadow is shorter than you, because that's when you can make vitamin D. You can't really make much vitamin D if your shadow is longer than you.
One of the giant books.
Yeah.
Things are heavy. So another interesting study I found in your book here was that who has the higher incidence of melanoma rates, outdoor workers or indoor workers?
Be the indoor workers.
The indoor workers.
Now, there's another thing, too. There are 2 types of melanin. There's eumelanin and pheomelanin. Eumelanin is the brown or black melanin. Pheomelanin is the reddish or yellowish melanin. So if you take the British, the Celtics, which have freckles and red hair and the pheomelanin, they have very little protection against melanoma. And the problem was a lot of them moved to Australia and had offspring that had this skin that's totally inappropriate for a region with probably the highest dose of UV due to the sun being closer to the Earth in the summer, the ozone hole spreading out over Australia. They really should have skin like the Aborigines, which is dark.
Mm-hmm.
But no. And so as a result, in Australia for years, the Cancer Society cowed the vitamin D researchers into not recommending sun exposure to get vitamin D because they're afraid of melanoma. Finally, the vitamin D researchers there are breaking out and realizing that sun exposure does have benefits, and they should be recommending both vitamin D and sun exposure.
Huh. And another thing was cool in your book was that most melanomas, they seem to occur on areas of your body that are the most covered up, such as maybe your trunk, your back, your upper legs, and even something I thought was really weird, the soles of your feet.
Right. So those areas could get a little bit of sun, or they can have another trigger for melanoma, whether it be from diet, from alcohol, or whatever else. And without having the sun's UVB rays coming in to fight it, that it can develop there sort of unimpeded.
Gotcha. In your book, overall, getting on to the next topic here, does bearing the sun, staying indoors all day, wearing sunscreen, what does the data show there? Does it increase or does it decrease overall maybe mortality rates or your risk of major diseases?
Staying indoors without sun exposure does increase all-cause mortality rate. There are some good studies out of Sweden. It was in the melanoma study where they actually looked at UV exposure and mortality rates, perhaps for women. And they found maybe a 30% increase in mortality rates for those that had the least amount of sun exposure compared to the most amount of sun exposure.
Wow. Let's see here. Yes, in your book, we've got increased sun exposure. Many cancer rates go down. We got breast, ovarian, prostate, pancreatic, bladder, brain, colon, lung, lymphomas, leukemia, kidney, etc. Tons of cancer goes down. And then it seems with increased sun exposure, also some major diseases. Dodo, what we have here?
This is breast cancer rates in the United States. And you see in the upper northeast United States is where you have the highest rates. And that's where they have the lowest UVB doses. And whereas in the southern southwest, you have the lowest rates, except for San Francisco area, where we have a lot of aerosols in the air. But this, if you remember the picture I showed of the UVB, this is sort of an inverse relationship between the two. With this high UVB, there's low breast cancer and colorectal cancer and so on.
So all the blue in that picture you just showed, those were the lower rates of cancer.
Right.
And the red.
It was Cedric and Frank Garland who first reported that in 1980. And they were beginning graduate students at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And it took them 6 years to get the findings published. And it didn't really catch on until finally when these newer maps came out, and I was able to show that there are about 15 types of cancer that had a similar pattern. And then people started investigating in more detail.
Now, also in your book, you go over, it's not just sun and cancer, sun exposure and cancer, it's sun exposure and some of the major diseases like osteoporosis, arthritis, heart disease, diabetes, asthma, Crohn's disease. All of that, at least in your book, you provide evidence that shows less sun exposure, more risk.
Right. Now, a number of those have inverse correlations with respect to sun exposure in summer. Cardiovascular disease has one with respect to sun exposure in winter, as do respiratory tract infections like influenza. In fact, one of the publications I made was based on the data here, showing that there's about a 15 to 30% difference in mortality rate between winter and summer. So, of course, you have several things changing. You have less sun, so you have less UV, you have lower temperature, you have different humidity, but you also have, what's interesting, you have variations in gene expression. And this just shows a paper from 2015 showing that many genes some are active in summer and some are active in winter. Now we know that animals and plants have seasonal variations, like they know when the reproductive cycle should kick in, they know when they should be migrating and so on. And whether that's caused by photoperiod change or temperature change or what, we're not quite sure. On the other hand, Michael Hollick and Jose Nezed have shown that if you supplement people with vitamin D, you can change gene expression from turning them on to turning them off or vice versa. So we do know that vitamin D supplementation and vitamin D levels affect gene expression, and perhaps that's what's happening between summer and winter. And so that would suggest that if one supplements or uses indoor UV lamps and the lamps in the winter, one can keep the gene expression appropriate for summer and optimal disease. This is just sort of an idea. I don't think it's been tested, but I mean, there are benefits for keeping vitamin D levels high. Whether it's through the gene expression on a global scale is not clear.
So, by the way, anybody who needs those charts he's showing can get them on his website, sunarc.org. Most of them I've seen on them. So what would you say then are the best ways to go about generating vitamin D?
Well, if one were to generate vitamin D from UV, either go in the sun in the middle of the day or use a UVB lamp that doesn't have very much UVA. One of the problems I think with tanning bed lamps is that they only have about 2% of the relative UVB 2% of UV is from UVB and 98% from UVA. Whereas midday sun, like in the Mediterranean, is more like 4% UVB and 96% UVA. And I think this balance is important. I also think that you don't want to have an intensity that's too high because there is damage from UV exposure, and the body, the skin can correct the damage. It turns out the eumelanin can help correct the DNA damage. It has mechanisms to go out and help correct the damage and repair the cells. But if you overwhelm it, then you start getting sunburn and possibly melanoma, skin cancer, and so on.
And that's when some rates of, I think I've seen non-melanoma, NM skin cancer go up, right?
Right. On the other hand, the most efficient way to get vitamin D is through supplements with vitamin D3. And
is there a universal dose you think people should take, or really test and then take according to your level?
Well, it's a little complicated. First of all, I mean, there are formula. If you go to grassrootshealth.net, they have a formula for how much vitamin D you might want to take based on your weight and a few other factors to reach whatever concentration you want. But there's so many individual factors that genetic factors affect how you process the vitamin D to become 25-hydroxy vitamin D, how well you absorb it in your GI tract, what food you eat it with, what time of day you take it, whether you're taking daily or weekly or monthly vitamin D. The 25-hydroxy vitamin D has about a 2-week half-life. So you could take it, say, weekly and still sort of keep it more or less constant level. But it turns out most of the effects of vitamin D are through vitamin D entering the vitamin D receptor, coupled to chromosomes and affecting gene expression, maybe affecting 10, 20% of the human genome. So it upregulates some genes and downregulates others, like it's shown in the picture I showed earlier. But on the other hand, there are things such as effects on the epithelial layer of the surface layer of many of the organs that may be activated by vitamin D and calcium without the vitamin D being converted to 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And the vitamin D is converted to 25-hydroxyvitamin D within a day or two. So, and then for example, if you're a pregnant woman, if you're a nursing woman, nursing your infant, the infant wants to get unprocessed vitamin D in order to process it itself. And so then it's important to have daily dosing. Now, in terms of you're probably aware that the Institute of Medicine recommended that in 2010 that the dose of vitamin D per day for everybody should be about 600 IU per day, unless they're over the age of 70, then they go 800 IU per day, and with the goal of reaching 20 nanograms per milliliter or 50 nanomoles per liter. That was based on what they knew about vitamin D in bones from clinical trials at that time. And if you consider that one can make 10,000 to 20,000 IU of vitamin D per day in the sun, midday sun with a whole body exposure, then we know that the body is used to being able to deal with that much. In fact, there's very little harm from taking 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 IU per day. It's found that in Africa, the agrarian people out in the sun can have levels around 40 to 50 nanograms per milliliter. The average white American has around 20 nanograms per milliliter in the winter and 30 nanograms per milliliter in the summer. The average black around 16 nanograms, the average Hispanic around 20, 21 nanograms per milliliter. So what you want to do is you want to try to get up around 30, 40, 50 nanograms per milliliter, which is going to take, it may take, for example, I take 5,000 IU per day, and my levels are just below, concentration just below 60 nanograms per milliliter, which I consider a good level. It's hard to overdose. There's one classic example in the literature of a vitamin mineral guru who was taking a powder where it had 1 million IU per scoop per day. After a month or two, he was very sick. He couldn't think straight. He had bloody feet. He called in Michael Hollick. Michael Hollick tested the powder and tested him and found out that his level was up to 900 nanograms per milliliter. And when they got him down to 400 nanograms per milliliter, his hypercalcemia went away and he was back to good health. So testing can take, I mean, if you can go to your physician and get a test, part of your insurance policy, you might want to do that. Or you can go to Grassroots Health and ask for a home test kit for around $65, $70. But on the other hand, if you just want to say, well, I know that vitamin D is good, I want to raise my level. So what you might do is take 100,000, 200,000 IU of vitamin D3, and then go to maybe 5,000 IU per day. By taking the large bolus dose, you sort of rapidly increase your 25-hydroxy-D concentration, and then you can get on and just sort of maintain that. And then maybe after a couple of months, you have a test and find out if you've reached what you want to reach. Of course, if you're a large person, you want to take more. If you're out in the sun quite a bit, you want to take maybe a little less in the summer. If you're dark skinned, you want to take more. Vitamin D is very, very inexpensive. A year's supply through the internet might cost $10. Mm-hmm. Testing, like I say, is much more. So there's sort of a trade-off there.
Another thing been seeing a lot of lately are people having problems with their vitamin D receptors or some kind of a genetic issue, whereas it makes them not able to process vitamin D enough or convert sunlight into vitamin D. I know those The websites, 23andMe, it doesn't do it, but a couple of them do it. Is that something people should look into to see if they have a problem there with vitamin D conversion?
No, that might be an expensive test. The best thing to do is to supplement with vitamin D, and then after you've reached what you think is, after you've been supplementing for a while, then have your 25-hydroxyvitamin D tested and figure out where you are, and then adjust your vitamin D dose.
Gotcha. Okay, so one final area in your book that I like to talk about really quickly is sun exposure and infection.
Right.
So we see flu and pneumonia, for instance, tend to be seasonal. Most deaths in the north are from December to March, and in the south from June to September. What are you showing me there?
That's Hope Simpson's picture from 1981, showing exactly that.
Oh, really? Cool.
For the top one is the northern hemisphere, the bottom is the southern hemisphere. And you've got month from January to December.
So
and
the peak are, what is the peak showing in that graph?
Okay, January is a peak in the northern hemisphere, July is a peak in the southern hemisphere.
Okay.
For influenza.
And
so,
go ahead.
So John Cannell looked at that and in 1996 published a paper saying that he thought that influenza was seasonal due to low UVB in winter. It turns out it's more complex. It turns out influenza rates are also linked to temperature and humidity. But it turns out through clinical trials, they've shown that supplementing with vitamin D does reduce the risk of influenza. And what I showed back in 2009 was if you look at the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic in the United States, the case fatality rate was much lower in the Southwest than in the Northeast. And the case fatality rate was due to pneumonia. So what this suggested was that UVB, through reducing the risk of pneumonia, kept these people alive. And the mechanisms we suggested were production of cathelicidin, which can destroy viruses and bacteria, and that vitamin D can reduce the production of inflammatory cytokines and chemokines that cause inflammation and sort of adversely affect the linings of the lungs, and then let all the bacteria and the viruses and the fungi infiltrate and cause pneumonia. And that seems to be probably what happened, and that seems to be part of what's happening with COVID-19.
Oh, very cool. I also saw in your book that sunlight, I guess vitamin D and sunlight, I think in two separate ways, lead to an increase or an energizing of T cells.
Yeah. Okay. I guess the first things were the innate immunity. No matter, because innate immunity works on viruses and bacteria, no matter what they are, without any memory of what they were. I guess the T cells are part of the adaptive system, and then they have to factor in what it is they're responding to. I haven't really studied T cells much, but I think you're right that vitamin D does help them as well.
Gotcha. So it's kind of a combination of things, like you said.
Right.
All right. So now let's get on to what you have been just prolific at lately on Twitter, WB Grant 2 on Twitter, and that is vitamin D and COVID-19. Now, I wrote a blog post about this in, I want to say last April, when some of that information, some of those studies were just being published, but since then we've gotten a lot more information on it. So have at it. What do you know here? Okay,
so we did the first review published in Nutrients on April 2nd, where we just said, hey, there's good evidence from acute respiratory tract infections from clinical trials with vitamin D that vitamin D does reduce the risk. And since COVID-19 starts in the lungs and is going to be considered in part a respiratory tract infection, we hypothesized that vitamin D would have an impact on it, and that the primary things would be induction of cathelicidin and defensins to destroy the virus, and also vitamin D, by regulating the production of cytokines, would tend to promote the anti-inflammatory cytokines and reduce the production of the pro-inflammatory cytokines. This paper, I'm amazed, already has over 600 citations at scholar.google.com. It's just taken off like a rocket. And so by now, there may be 20 or so observational studies. And the observational studies show sort of like this, that the people with the lower risk of adverse effects have higher concentrations than those with the more severe aspects, or those more likely to have died from COVID-19. Here's again 12, above and below 12 nanograms per milliliter in Germany. Maybe 25% with below 12 nanograms died versus 2 or 3% with above 12 nanograms per milliliter. So now the medical system does not really accept evidence based on observational studies. They went clinical trials. So we do have now several clinical trials, but the foremost one is from Cordoba, Alicante, Spain, in which they took 76 patients in a hospital, and they were all given the standard treatment, hydroxychloroquine and an antibiotic. 50 of them were treated with high dose with high dose 25 hydroxyvitamin D2. So there was vitamin D, 25 hydroxyvitamin D2 is essentially what would happen if you deactivate vitamin D2 and it's processed in liver, which calcifidiol, and that might take 2 or 3 days to process. So they were giving these people the equivalent of 130 IU of vitamin D2 in the first week, and half of that in the second week until discharge. And then they had 26 that were not treated. The results were that of the ones who were treated, only one went to the ICU and none died. Of those who were not treated, half of them went to the ICU and 2 died. So this showed a tremendous effect of using a vitamin D compound, a vitamin D metabolite, to treat people with COVID-19 and greatly reduce the progression and the severity. Now, unfortunately, our Food and Drug Administration and our CDC and our NIH side with big pharma, and they really prefer something they can sell, which is vaccines and drugs. So even though we have these there are some other clinical trials and more. Well, there are also some accidental studies in France were very interesting. In one case, he had a care home, a nursing home, with a lot of 88-year-old plus or minus 10-year-old people, and COVID-19 came through. Now, fortunately, this care home had been giving patients 80,000 IU of vitamin D every 2 or 3 months. So of those who had received that dose within a month before the COVID or within a week after COVID hit, only I think it was 44% died. But of those who were not treated, it was a much higher number. And it showed that having vitamin D in their system really protected against the more severe form of COVID. So what we're, now there are a number of mechanisms that have been identified, like I said, just sort of like for influenza. What I'm recommending, and I think some of my colleagues are as well, like at vitamindwiki.com and grassrootshealth.net, is if you, first of all, if you're a healthcare worker, if you're obese, if you're elderly, if you have chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease or diabetes or cancer or hypertension, and you have not been taking vitamin D, you should go out and get vitamin D and take 100 to 200,000 IU of vitamin D3 in a day or two. You might want to take some magnesium with that because vitamin D uses magnesium in its actions. And if you're worried about vitamin D putting calcium in the arteries instead of in the bones, take some vitamin K2, which will help put it in the right places. You can also get nattokinase. So you take your high dose of vitamin D, and then you start taking 5,000 or 10,000 IU per day. And at some point, you might want to have your 25-hydroxyvitamin D measured. But by keeping your vitamin D levels up, you're going to compensate for not having sunlight in the summer, at least in terms of the vitamin D level. And you'll have a good chance of reducing the severity of COVID and greatly reducing the risk of death. So, there's sort of, I've written a news release called How Big Pharma Uses the Disinformation Playbook to Suppress Information on Vitamin D.
Right.
And it's published at the Orthomolecular Medicine news site. And what they do is they have 5 principal ways that have been used by the tobacco organizations and the sugar organizations and National Football League and big oil and so on. The first thing they do is they attack the leaders of the field. So Michael Holick, being the #1 man in vitamin D in the United States, the New York Times published a big expose on how he got money from the indoor tanning industry and didn't disclose his funding from whatever. Well, I mean, of course, physicians always get money from big pharma. Are they?
Yeah.
The second thing they do is they publish bad papers and say, see, it doesn't work. Well, that's easy to do on vitamin D because the clinical trials used for vitamin D have primarily been based on the guidelines for pharmaceutical drugs. The 2 assumptions for pharmaceutical drugs in trials are, 1, that the only source of the agent is in the trial, and number 2, there's a linear dose-response relationship. So if you give everybody the same dose, you should see an effect. Well, it turns out that the sun is a source, diet is a source, including meat and fish and so on, and supplements are a source. And then it's hard to find people with low 25-hydroxyvitamin D who will participate in the studies. They're often people of dark skin, lower socioeconomic status people, people not really in good health care, and they still don't even respond to invitation to be in these studies. So you get people with above average 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and then instead of giving them like a half-day sun exposure version of vitamin D, like 10,000 IU per day, they might give them 2,000, or if you're lucky, 4,000 IU per day, or sometimes just 1,000. And then like the VITAL study and the diabetes study out of Tufts, you come at the end and you find that for the 25,000 participants in the VITAL study on cancer, with a 2,000 to 4,000 patients who are pre-diabetic and diabetes, you find for the entire group, there's no beneficial effect. But if you look under the hood and you see that, oh, people who have low BMI, they benefited. People with dark skin benefited. Maybe in diabetes, people not taking calcium benefited. Oh, and then if you look at 25-hydroxyvitamin D during the trial, the diabetes trial, oh, people with higher 25-hydroxyvitamin D benefited. But that's not in the abstract at New England Journal of Medicine. It's not in the press releases. And people say, see, vitamin D doesn't work.
Yeah.
The third thing that the big pharma does is it funds universities. It advertises heavily in all the media. And so there's an embargo on publicizing the beneficial effects of vitamin D in the public media. I'll send off an announcement about the latest finding on COVID or something else to the local or national media. And it's just ignored because they know if they start promoting vitamin D, they might lose their funding from big pharma. The fourth thing is they put their people in charge of the agencies and boards and journals, et cetera, et cetera. And so you see at the FDA, CDC, and NIH, the people in charge are primarily from big pharma, and they work on a revolving door basis. You come in from big pharma, you work in the agency for a while, you go back to big pharma when you leave. And so you know if you place good while you're in the organization, you'll get a good job when you go out. And so it's just, and even if you have a clinical trial, the FDA is reluctant to accept it. They will accept a clinical trial from big pharma if it shows a small benefit compared to placebo, even if it's not as good as other drugs on the market. And of course, they never compare these drugs to vitamin D, never.
Yeah.
So we have, so like grassroots health has realized this from the start, which is why they call themselves grassroots health, because they know they've got to try to let the public know rather than trying to convince the organizations, the drug organizations, the disease organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm glad you're doing what you're doing to try to get the word out. It's just, we need all the help we can. And I've been working on this for now over 20 years, Mycoholic over 50 years. And it's just a long way to go, but we're making progress. We're getting good results, and it's just delightful to see progress. I hope I live long enough to see vitamin D accepted.
And keep popping that D. I've been always wondering, why is it that we see, you see, wear your masks, lockdown, social distance, the vaccines are coming, get ready for the vaccines. Not one peep from anybody in the CDC or anything like that, or anybody at one of the talking heads about, hey, go check your vitamin D levels, dudes, and see where you are. And then you might want to take a big dose to get you up to speed and then start supplementing.
Yeah. Now there's some ray of hope in England, Ireland, Scotland. There is now a movement to recognize that vitamin D does reduce the risk of COVID. The government is now promising to give people free vitamin D, only 400 IU per day.
I saw that. That was ridiculous, 400 IU.
And in Alicante, Spain, where they did that clinical trial, I understand the government is now promoting the idea that calcifediol might be useful in preventing or treating COVID. So we're getting the camel's nose under the tent slowly. Hopefully we'll start getting more of the body in there.
So from all your research right now, to wrap it up here, people, in order to prevent COVID, or at least you start off with a pretty big dose. If you were in one of the high risk categories, obesity, darker skin, diabetes, stuff like that, a higher dose of vitamin D initially, so 100,000 to 200,000 IUs. And then immediately the next day, get on 5,000 a day.
5,000 to 10,000.
5 to 10,000 a day, and then test your levels, maybe a month after that?
Maybe a month after that, yeah.
Maybe a month after that. And then for someone,
And you want to be above 40, more like towards 50 or 60 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay, so get above 40, 50, 60 is a sweet spot. And then have you seen any research on if you get COVID, is there a different path you want to take while you have it? Do you want to increase the amount? Does that help at all, increasing the amount of vitamin D you take while you have COVID?
Well, you probably want to take a nice bolus dose when you think you're getting it, at the first symptoms. See, what happens is you first become seropositive, and it turns out maybe if you have 20 nanograms per milliliter, according to the Mycoholic study, 18% of the population is seropositive, the adult population is seropositive for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now, you don't get COVID-19 unless your immune system misfunctions. And so you start producing more cytokines, you start revving up. So if you start getting some of the symptoms, it's worthwhile, I found out, to try to understand what the symptoms are. I mean, you have some symptoms like just like a cold or influenza, but it's when you start getting body aches and major diarrhea, headaches, not sleeping well. So you start getting, better look the symptoms up. When you start getting them, that means that COVID has started and it's going to progress, and you really want to try to nip it in the bud, because if you don't stop it before it progresses, you can have permanent damage or long-term damage. They talk about the long haulers now. And it's really, a lot of medicine is really only controlling the symptoms not really treating the disease. So your immune system is what's really trying to treat the disease. And vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, magnesium are all helping to improve your immune system. So you also want to think about taking some good vitamin C, maybe a gram an hour for a while, and some zinc and some magnesium, like I mentioned. But you really want to rev up your immune system, and then
Gotcha.
hopefully stay out of the hospital.
Yeah. And one more thing I wanted to bring back up. So you mentioned when you are taking vitamin D supplements, you might want to take, you added two things in there. You might want to take magnesium and K2. Can you really briefly just get into the specific reasons why you'd want to do that?
Yeah, so like I said, magnesium is used by enzymes that are related to vitamin D. And it could be the case that if you deplete your free magnesium stores, you might start affecting your heart function. But also I found that at night, if you have leg cramps, that can be due to magnesium deficiency. So I always take magnesium, maybe 200 to 400 milligrams a day of magnesium, not magnesium oxide, but any other type of magnesium, right, to reduce that effect. And like I say, on the short term, K2 may not be so important, but if you're taking vitamin D on long term, you do want to be, and especially high dose, you do want to take K2 either as K2 or nattokinase.
And that's to prevent some calcification that could occur?
Right. And calcification of the arteries increases blood pressure, hypertension risk, and that's not good.
Okay. All right, good. Well, you are the vitamin D expert, so I am going to follow your advice. Dr. Grant, thank you. This has been very awesome. I'm going to link below this interview to some of the studies that you showed, your big pharma article. I want people to read that.
Okay.
And then for anyone, again, you want to go buy Embrace the Sun on Amazon right now. And then I think the best place to find you is your Twitter page, right?
That's where I'm most active, yes.
Yeah, you are very active on Twitter. I love your feed, and you're posting great studies and insights all day long. Your feed is at WB Grant2, the number 2.
Right.
Awesome, doctor. Well, thank you very much for coming today, and I will see you soon.
Thanks for the invitation. My pleasure. Good meeting you too.